Before the Romans ruled the land, they learned to conquer the sea. But the story of the Roman navy didn't begin with mighty fleets or seasoned sailors. It began with fear. Fear of the water. For centuries, Romans were land soldiers. They built walls, roads, and legions that could march across continents. But the sea, that belonged to others. To the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and above all, to Carthage. The Mediterranean was their weakness, and the Romans knew it. Every ship that passed beyond their horizon was a reminder that power didn't just grow from the soil. It sailed with the wind. When the First Punic War erupted in the 3rd century BCE, Rome faced its greatest enemy, Carthage, the masters of maritime trade. Carthage's navy was enormous, hundreds of sleek warships, built for ramming, boarding, and blockading. Rome had none. Not one war fleet to its name. But this was not a people who accepted limits. Roman engineers captured a single Carthaginian quinquereme, a massive 5-tiered warship, after it ran aground. They studied it like a puzzle from the gods, measuring every plank, every nail, every joint. Then, they built 100 copies, in just 2 months. The Romans didn't just imitate, they improved. They were not born sailors, but they were born strategists. Instead of relying on seamanship, they turned sea battles into land battles. They built a device that would change naval warfare forever, the corvus, or raven. The corvus was a wooden boarding bridge, about 36 feet long, with an iron spike at its end. When a Roman ship drew close to an enemy, the bridge dropped like a hammer, piercing the enemy deck and locking the two ships together. Now, the sea became a battlefield Rome could understand, a place for soldiers, not sailors. Legionaries rushed across the corvus with swords and shields, turning chaotic sea clashes into disciplined infantry combat. The first time they used it, at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the Carthaginians laughed until the bridges fell. One by one, Roman ships grappled the enemy, and Carthaginian decks turned crimson. That day, Rome, a nation of farmers and foot soldiers, destroyed the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. The victory stunned the world. For the first time, the waves echoed with the sound of Roman steel. But the sea demanded a price. Storms wrecked hundreds of their new ships. Thousands of sailors drowned. The Romans learned that water was not conquered as easily as land. And yet, they kept building, ship after ship, storm after storm. They rebuilt their fleet again and again, faster than any other power could react. Their genius was not in navigation, but in organization. Each ship was a piece of a machine, an empire learning to breathe through sails. By the time of the Battle of Actium in 256 BCE, Rome had created the largest navy the ancient world had ever seen, over 300 warships, carrying nearly 150,000 men. The battle was so massive that later historians called it the Trafalgar of antiquity. It was chaos and brilliance combined. The Roman formation, shaped like a wedge, crashed into the Carthaginian line. The sea boiled with splintered oars, screams, and smoke. The corvus bridges fell once more, and the Romans swarmed ship after ship. By the battle's end, Carthage's proud navy was broken, and Rome stood as the new master of the Mediterranean. But this new mastery didn't stop at victory. It evolved. The Romans began to see ships not just as weapons, but as tools of empire. They built naval bases, supply harbors, and coastal fortresses. They trained specialized sailors, the classiarii, and developed entire fleets, each stationed in different regions. The navy became a shadow army that could move grain, soldiers, and ideas faster than any rival empire. Rome's sea power turned conquest into communication. Yet beneath all this triumph, there was something almost poetic. A civilization born on land, learning to trust the ocean. Each sailor, whether Roman or foreign-born, carried the same fear. The horizon, out there, beyond sight of land, the sea still whispered the name of its old masters, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, the pirates who ruled before. Rome might command the surface, but the deep still belonged to mystery. Still, the Romans adapted. They built ships not of elegance, but of endurance, heavy, square, and disciplined, like their legions. They learned to anchor in storms, to follow the stars, to map coastlines with mathematical precision. The Mediterranean, once called Mare Nostrum, our sea, truly became theirs. But Rome's dominance brought new challenges. Controlling the waves meant confronting pirates, rebellions, and even their own ambition. The sea that had made them powerful could just as easily destroy them. By the time Julius Caesar rose to power, the Roman navy had become a symbol, not just of strength, but of civilization itself. Wherever Roman ships arrived, so did law, roads, and Latin words. But that story, the transformation of the navy from weapon to empire builder, was still to come. Because the Roman navy didn't just fight wars, it created a new kind of world. One connected not by blood or conquest, but by water. And it all began with one captured ship. When the last Carthaginian ship slipped beneath the Mediterranean waves, Rome stood alone upon the waters it had once feared. But the victory was only the beginning. The Romans had learned to fight at sea, yet they still did not truly understand the ocean. They had built a navy to win a war, not to rule an empire of tides and tempests. Now the sea demanded something greater: discipline, patience, and mastery. The early admirals of Rome were not sailors by birth. They were soldiers, engineers, and politicians trying to command a world that moved with wind and wave instead of stone and soil. But from their struggles grew something new, a system. Rome divided the Mediterranean with the same order it imposed on land. Fleets were stationed like legions, anchored in strongholds from Ravenna to Alexandria. Each port became a small floating city with its own shipwrights, doctors, scribes, and forges. The navy's purpose changed. It was no longer just to fight, but to connect. Every grain shipment to feed the people of Rome, every legion that crossed from Italy to distant provinces, every message carried across the empire relied on those fleets. The sea became the empire's bloodstream, its movement, its voice. But the waves had their own enemies. After Carthage fell, piracy grew like a disease. Bands of outlaws roamed the coasts, attacking trade routes and burning villages. They captured ships, kidnapped Roman citizens, and sold them back for ransom. At the height of the crisis, Rome itself began to starve. Its grain ships from Africa and Egypt could no longer pass safely. Then came Pompey the Great. In 67 BCE, he was given extraordinary powers to cleanse the seas of pirates. What had seemed impossible, he achieved with precision. He divided the Mediterranean into zones, each patrolled by a Roman fleet. His ships moved like a single machine. Within months, the pirates were gone, their strongholds destroyed, their power broken. It was not just a victory of arms, but of organization. Rome had turned the sea into a system. With piracy crushed, trade flourished. Rome's navy became a guardian, not a conqueror. The sea was now called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Julius Caesar took it further. During his campaigns in Gaul and Britain, the navy became his invisible army. It carried his troops, guarded his supplies, and turned the tides of his wars. When enemies fled to sea, his ships followed. Caesar understood what few before him had realized. Control of the sea meant control of destiny. When Augustus came to power, he gave the navy its final form. He turned it from a temporary weapon into a permanent force. Great harbors were built: Ostia near Rome, Portus with its massive seawalls, and countless others along the coasts of Africa and Greece. The navy became professional, disciplined, and ever-present. Its sailors were not short-term fighters but career men, trained to live and die on the waves. At its height, the Roman navy had over 1,000 warships. They patrolled from the Pillars of Hercules to the Red Sea, carrying the Eagle of Rome to every shore. The empire had found its rhythm upon the water. What had begun as imitation of Carthage had become innovation. Roman engineers perfected their craft. They designed lighter, faster ships such as the Liburna, borrowed from the pirates they once hunted, and used them for patrol and pursuit. These ships could move through narrow channels, chase raiders, or escort merchant fleets. The larger triremes and quinqueremes remained as symbols of power, floating fortresses for battle. Every movement at sea reflected Roman discipline. Fleets sailed in formation, rows of oars rising and falling together like the legs of a single creature. The sound of drums kept time as the ships cut through water under blood-red sails. To witness such a fleet was to see the empire in motion, calm, relentless, and beautiful in its precision. But the greatest test came not from beyond, but from within. After Caesar's death, Rome descended into civil war, and the sea became a battlefield once more. Two powers faced each other for control of the world, Octavian and Mark Antony. At Actium in 31 BCE, their fleets met in a storm of wind and fire. Antony's ships were massive and slow, covered in towers and armor. Octavian's, commanded by his admiral Agrippa, were light, swift, and deadly. The sea favored speed. Agrippa's ships outmaneuvered the giants, surrounding them in tight formations. Fire arrows streaked through the air, sails burned, and the ocean filled with wreckage. Cleopatra's fleet fled first, Antony followed, and the empire was decided in the space of a single dawn. From that victory rose Augustus, and with him the Roman Empire as the world would know it. Actium proved that the sea no longer belonged to chance. It belonged to Rome. For 200 years, the navy upheld what became known as the Roman peace. No great enemy fleets challenged them again. The navy's task became one of order and endurance. They escorted merchant ships, patrolled coastlines, hunted the last pirates, and guarded the grain routes that fed millions. The Mediterranean, once a theater of chaos, became a highway of civilization. Roman sailors lived lives of quiet sacrifice. Many were not born Romans but came from Greece, Syria, Egypt, and Africa. They spoke dozens of tongues but served under one flag. Their reward for years at sea was citizenship, the right to call themselves Roman. They fought stop RMS, disease, and time itself to keep the empire alive. Each fleet guarded its corner of the world, the Classis Britannica in the cold northern waters, the Classis Alexandrina on the Red Sea, the Classis Germanica along the Rhine. Together, they formed a shield that spanned continents. The empire was no longer held only by soldiers on land, but by sailors unseen. Their legacy was more than victory. It was connection. Because of them, goods from India reached Spain, grain from Egypt fed Rome, and marble from Greece built temples in Britain. The navy made the Mediterranean not a barrier, but a bridge. But empires are not eternal. In time, the same sea that carried Rome's triumph began to carry its troubles. The fleets grew weaker as civil wars drained their strength. Pirates returned, storms wrecked neglected harbors, and enemies came from directions the navy could no longer guard. By the 3rd century, Rome's command of the waves was fading. Yet even as the empire itself declined, the idea it created endured. The Byzantine Empire inherited its fleets, the Italian city-states learned from its design, and centuries later, nations like Britain built their sea power upon Roman principles. Rome had done more than fight at sea. It had invented the very concept of naval dominance. The corves, the formations, the permanent fleets, the ports. They were not just weapons, but systems of control and communication. What began with one captured Carthaginian ship ended as a blueprint for empire. The Romans taught the world that the ocean, though wild and eternal, could be mastered by will and order. Their ships carried more than soldiers and cargo. They carried the soul of a civilization that believed nothing was beyond human reach.